here in relation to the birth of Jesus, but not just because people are curious about the birth of Jesus, not just because people really like to know about the birth of Jesus, because there are other characters in the Bible we really like to know the birth of. For instance, Melchizedek is one of them that I'd really like to know where he comes from, who his parents are, but we're never told. It wouldn't be necessary that Jesus were. Many of the apostles themselves, many individuals that come in and out of the story of Jesus as well as the New Testament, we don't know much about their childhood or their youth, and we especially aren't given their birth. And yet Jesus is, but it's for a particular reason. If you notice there, he ended with the prophecy from Isaiah chapter 7. And so this whole concept comes back to this point. But we're talking about Joseph right here. And one of the important aspects here of Matthew chapter 1, 18 through 25, really the end of the chapter, is the concept of this betrothal. Now, we live in a culture that's a lot different than the culture that the Israelites lived in. There are some similarities that Jesus particularly lived in. There are some similarities. We live in a culture that assumes the worst, and that's unfortunate. Oftentimes, when the possibility is that you could take something for the good or you could take something for the bad, you see something happening, we immediately assume the worst. And we can fall into that trap just as easily as the world does. When my wife and I were dating, we went to the mall with her little brother Matthew. He was 6 or 7, maybe 8 years old. And we got the nastiest looks from some people. I'm 15 or 16 years old, and people assume the worst. When we first got married, or actually in Fort Wayne, our first year, after our first year of being married, she gave birth to Carmen, and we were taking the baby around town, doing the various things. And she has always been younger than she looked. She's always looked younger than she was. There we go. And so, people would see us walking around the mall in Fort Wayne with this baby, and they would give us nasty looks. She's 18 years old, and we've been married for a year and a half. Come on, people, let go. But people always assume the worst. They give you these scandalous looks. And it could be anything. It could be any number of world situations that is entirely innocuous, or even good for that matter. But people of this world, and sometimes even we ourselves, get caught up in thinking the worst of people, and that's unfortunate. When it came to betrothals, or being engaged is how we would word it, but it was nothing like our concept of engagement, not really. Our concept of engagement is, hey, we kind of promise maybe to marry you in, however long we've determined. In relation to betrothal in those days, it often lasted 18 months. Or 10 plus months oftentimes, but sometimes 18 months. I mean, if you really look into it, you would find that Jacob and Rachel were married or were betrothed for 14 years. Now, the circumstances were somewhat different. Laban required 7 years of service for Rachel and then tricked him into marrying Leah, but whatever. But it happened, and we see it, for instance, in Samson. Samson's first wife, in fact, he was betrothed to her, and which is why he's on the road when he finds the lion, which is kind of interesting. Nowadays, we have people who are engaged to be engaged. What? It's ridiculous. We're planning on getting engaged. What in the world's going on? Or a lot of people like to, unfortunately, they want a dry run of marriage, and they live together for a time. And that's not what he's talking about here. When he talks about betrothal, they are not legitimately, technically married in the sense that they have a sexual right to one another. But they are still effectively married in relation to the law, which I find really interesting. Because an engagement could not be ended for just any reason. This betrothal was required to be ended for specific legal reasons, the same legal reasons that a person would divorce from a particular marriage. That was how strong a betrothal was. And there were legal ramifications. In Deuteronomy chapter 22 talks about some of the legal ramifications of infidelity, and they would apply to the marriage bed as well. The first time that the two had relations, that if one or the other was not a virgin as they had described, then there were ramifications for that. This was a legal matter, and even a betrothal. So it wasn't something that could just be ended on a whim or any way that they'd like. And we find these two individuals, Mary and Joseph, they are betrothed. And we know the character, especially of Mary, but we find the character of Joseph here in this story, though most people don't know about Joseph. They don't know much about him, and to be fair, not a lot is said about Joseph. explicitly. We do know some things implicitly in relation to how Jesus was raised. We know implicitly that he was taken care of, and that Joseph, as we find out Jesus getting older, Joseph has a decent reputation amongst the people of his area anyway, because when Jesus goes to speak to the people in his hometown and in the areas around there, what do they say about him? They don't say, hey, isn't this that illegitimate man's problem? Isn't this that guy's son who's always awful and steals from us? No, he's the carpenter's son. Which is to say, innocuous, that he was the person they expected him to be. In particular, though, we have, the Bible describes a just man. Specifically, in verse 19, that Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. Why? Because in verse 18 we find that she has conceived of a child. Now, I know that immaculate conception has been used numerous times to explain away premature pregnancies before the time people intended on having babies. And many jokes about such a thing, but it wasn't a common thing to think about even at that time, especially at that time. Really, Jesus kind of opens the door to that idea. And we know, because of the situation at hand, that it was God's plan that this take place, that she be with child. It was, in fact, God's doing, the Holy Spirit coming upon her and giving her this child. But from Joseph's perspective, think about it. When a woman became pregnant while they were betrothed, there was a reason. And there are a number of explanations for it. There are a number of situations. And yes, she could have made a mistake and fallen victim to sin. Or she could have fallen victim to some horrible act. But he has no explanation currently. She seems as dumbfounded as he is, at least for the time, until things are explained to them. And how do you deal with that? How do you deal with your betrothed, this woman that you intend on marrying, she is suddenly with child? You know how that works. If you're old enough to know how that works, you know how that works. And something has happened. And what's interesting is that he has options. He has a decision to make. And while it's tempting for us to say, well, why didn't he just make the obvious decision? There isn't really an obvious decision in this situation. It's a very complicated situation, in fact. One option, which is what he intends on doing, or what he could consider, is to remain betrothed and appear to the people around him as sinful. Because the people around him know something about what happens when people get pregnant, how that works. And if he takes her as his betrothed, they would anticipate, if it was not his child, they would expect him to put her away. Most predominantly by the people at that time, to put her away in the most horrible way possible. They would expect Joseph to act like they did, and oftentimes they would put her away in the harshest of consequences. In Proverbs 22, we find that we say, well, why should he care? Why should he care what people think? Well, the Bible actually tells us a good name is more valuable than great riches, even more important than gold or silver. Now he, of course, doesn't have all the information that we do. He is not privy to what's actually happened yet. And I find it interesting that God doesn't tell him ahead of time. God doesn't warn him. Almost to the degree that he says, remember, when he says that Abraham was a righteous man, Abraham was justified because of his faith in him. And we, if all the stories and all the things that Abraham goes through, if they didn't happen, we would say, well, how do you know that Abraham was that way? Well, we just have to trust God. They would say, well, you should have the faith of Abraham. And if Abraham hadn't taken his son Isaac up on the mountain to worship God and to sacrifice him because God had told him to, we wouldn't know how faithful he was. If God hadn't called him out of Ur of the Chaldees, we wouldn't know how faithful he was. And if God hadn't challenged him again and again, we wouldn't know how faithful he was. The same would go for Job. If these things hadn't happened, he couldn't use Job as an example of patience. And so God calls Joseph a just man. And if this situation doesn't happen, we don't know why God would call him that. We know that he is not a harsh man, that he is not a cruel man, that he is looking for the best of his betrothed and himself. And he considers the first option, to remain betrothed, but he knows that it would potentially sacrifice his character, his reputation amongst the people. It would cause problems, and some significant problems. Oftentimes a lot of times in that time, people who were found in such a situation would be ostracized from the group. They wouldn't go to him for work being done. So his carpentry would mean nothing then, and his life and his wife's life would be very difficult. He's got a lot of decisions to make. One in particular is what to do about this situation. He could also exact the harshest of consequences there from Deuteronomy chapter 22. If a person was found in infidelity, they were stoned to death. And Mary is in a precarious situation because she has what we perceive to be all the evidence. There is one person in this situation who can't really deny, according to human understanding, what's transpired here. She is carrying the evidence of what we would perceive to be her infidelity. And the Old Testament would demand in certain situations that she would be stoned to death. And he certainly could have pursued that. But there was a third option that he also considered from Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 31, if you wanted to read it. But Matthew chapter 19 is where we'll go, and that is to put her away quietly. And that's what he was considering doing. And you might feel that that was the wrong decision. And yeah, from our culture and our community and the way that we would handle things, it may very well be. It may be, to us, the wrong idea. But there were a lot of things to balance, and when God says that he was a just man, I take God with him, that he was a righteous man, intending on doing what was right. In verse 3, if you notice here, it says, the Pharisees also came to him, testing him, and saying to him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason? We've talked before about this, the situation of not only a betrothal, but also a marriage, because in legal terms, they were considered essentially the same thing. That you were promising yourself and or your family was promising you to another. Is it okay for you to break that or your marriage for just any reason? And some Jews would say, yes. If she displeased you in anything, if you found anything you didn't like about her, and the joke is always, if she burns the toast too many times, you can put her out, and you can potentially put her away. And Jesus, he says, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And the answer that Jesus gives is no. No. Can a man put away his wife for just any reason? Jesus says, he says no. So he doesn't actually say no. He effectively says no by giving them the answer he gives. That is unacceptable. That is not the way God intended on it. And so they conclude, verse 7, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? And that would be Numbers chapter 5, verses 11 through 33. Why in the world would Moses do that if it wasn't God's intention to do it? And what they're trying to get at is, they're trying to argue that Jesus is going to disagree with Moses. That he is going to put himself between the law and the people. But Jesus, he says to them, verse 8, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her, who is divorced, commits adultery. And in one fell swoop, he comments on what the parameters were of that original concept of divorce. When Moses allowed it, when he said some uncleanness or some issue with her, Jesus says this is what it was. This is what the issue was ever supposed to be. Not if she burned the toast or she became unpleasant to you or you didn't like her anymore. It has to do with sexual immorality. And so there was a situation now that the harshest consequence did not have to be exacted, in fact. That Joseph could, if he so chose, reasonably put her away quietly, which is what he was considering. But I want you to notice back in Matthew chapter 1, in verse 20. I want you to notice something about Joseph. And it's something I think gets overlooked a lot. He makes the choice inevitably, in part because of the additional information he is given. But if you are stuck in a situation like this, where you find out that your betrothed, the person that you care about and love, or maybe your wife or your husband, has cheated on you with another because she's pregnant and he knows it's not his, how do you respond? Hopefully we respond like Joseph did in verse 20. But while he thought about these things, there's no snap decision. There's no anger, no malice, no hatred, simply because his ways have not been taken into account. His desires haven't been brought in. In the process of him making this decision that would affect many lives, he is given this additional information in verse 22, or in verse 20. It is while he is thinking about these things, and that tells me a lot about Joseph, and a lot about how he feels about Mary. That he does not just get angry and fly off the handle and pursue this divorce or put her out or have her stoned. And I don't know about you, but I've known people who might very well have done that very thing, who would have made a rash and angry decision. But Joseph is not like that. And so he thinks about these things. And while he is thinking, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and gives him this information that Mary has done nothing wrong, that she is in fact a part of something greater, and the opportunity for Joseph to be a part of something greater. And that's not always easy to deal with. I always think about John the Baptizer, for instance. I think about Zacharias and Elizabeth, his parents, and how he could have been the Savior. He could have been the Messiah. And he came on the scenes, and he preaches and he teaches God's Word, and he's trying to instruct his family in Israel about Jesus, who would come. And he is one of the most humble people, even though he's got one of the most spectacular messages. One of the most spectacular messages anyone has heard in centuries. Because he's one of the first prophets. He's the first prophet to come back from this time of no one talking, or God not talking to the people. And yet, he says things like, the one who's coming, I do not deserve to even unstrap his sandals. I am not the Christ, but one comes after me who is. And they want to put him on a pedestal, and they want to lift him up, and probably just as they did with Jesus, if he had said yes, they would have tried to make him king. And yet he realized that while he wasn't the focus of that something better, he realized that he was going to play a big part in it. That he was going to play an important part. And here, Mary is playing a part. She is part of this. And Joseph is going to be a part of this. He is going to take care of this child. He is going to protect this child. He is going to have to make decisions in relation to the well-being of not only Israel, which he would understand it to be, but the world. And everyone's souls are affected by the decisions that Joseph is going to make. I gotta tell you, that would scare me. I come from this situation where my betrothed has theoretically cheated on me, and now I'm moving in another direction entirely, and I get this revelation. And this is the penultimate of the word revelation. This is information that is going to blow my mind. Am I ready for this? Not only to have a child and to deal with that, but that this child is going to be the most important person that will ever be, has ever been. That's a lot of responsibility. And yet Joseph, he listens to God. He listens to God and he trusts God. And he goes with God's plan, and he becomes the adopted father of the greatest man to walk the earth, of the most important person in human history, of the one who would do more than any of us could do combined. And so he becomes part of the fulfillment of a prophecy that he had been looking for. All these Israelites, and we talk regularly about these Israelites, especially the people in Jesus' day, but all the way from Moses' day, all the way from possibly even Adam and Eve, when they talk about the one who would come, that this seed of woman who would who would bruise the serpent's head after the serpent bruised his heel. And they've been wondering, and they've been questioning, who is this? Who is this individual that would come? Who is this prophet like unto Moses? Who is this Shiloh, who the scepter belongs to? Who is this individual that would be like David and would sit on the throne? Who is this Savior, this Messiah? Who is this suffering servant that Isaiah talked about? Who is going to die for the sins of mankind, and how is God going to manage this? And Joseph gets quite a bit of information when he's told that he is the Emmanuel, the God with us. And Joseph says, I'm going to get on board, because what's happening here is important. He becomes part of the fulfillment of this prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7. We read it here in verse 23. Behold, a virgin shall be with child and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Then Joseph, being aroused from sleep, did as the angel of the Lord commanded him, and took to him his wife, and did not know her till she had brought forth her firstborn son, and called his name Jesus. Now, he does not take the same line as Zacharias, who was told to name him John, and decided he was going to do his own thing, and then was kept from talking for a time, until he decided that John was a good enough name. It was the right name. But if we turn over to Isaiah chapter 7, we find an interesting situation. Because while Matthew will point to Isaiah 7, or he'll point back to Isaiah 7 accurately, that this is a prophecy of the virgin, Mary, bringing forth a son, and that he shall save his people from their sins. We also point back here to Isaiah chapter 7. If you notice in verse 10, you could back up and read the section and understand the fullness of what's going on, but the basics are here in verse 1. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, king of Judah. Now, we have to recognize first and foremost that he is a wicked king, an awful king, a terrible king, and not one that follows God. He says that Rezin, the king of Syria, and Pekah, the son of Remaliah, king of Israel, went up to Jerusalem to make war against it, but could not prevail against it. There's a lot of speculation as to why Remaliah and Pekah are coming up, Rezin and Pekah, there we go, are coming up against Judah. And a lot of it revolves around they wanted Judah to come with them against Assyria. And Judah said no. Judah didn't want to go up against Syria. And so we have this situation, or Assyria, I should say. The situation where he is distressed because these two are coming up against him. And yet, if you read the text, they're having no success. And of course, he can't attribute that to God. He can't attribute that to God protecting his people or anything like that. And so he continues to fuss and to fret. And he's deciding on what to do. And God tells Isaiah in verse 3, Then the Lord said to Isaiah, Go out now to meet Ahaz, you and Shear-Jeshub, that's his son, at the end of the aqueduct from the upper pool in the highway of the fuller's road, and say to him, Take heed and be quiet. I'm sure the king hasn't ever heard that before, unless Isaiah had already been there, which he hasn't, because this is the beginning of his ministry. Unless a prophet, I should say, had already come to him previously. I'm sure that he's never heard anyone tell him to be quiet. Do not fear or be faint-hearted for these two stubs of smoking firebrands, for the fierce anger of Rezin in Syria, and the son of Remaliah, because Syria, Ephraim, and the sons of Remaliah have plotted evil against you, saying, Let us go up against Judah, and trouble it, and let us make a gap in its wall for ourselves, and to set a king over them, the son of Tabal. Thus says the Lord God, It shall not stand. And you can really stop there, and that would tell you what's about to happen. This is not going to work. That these two and any of their compatriots that come against Judah, they're not going to conquer it. They're not going to win the day. You are going to be safe. And that was the message that Isaiah was supposed to take to Ahaz. And so when he goes to Ahaz, verse 10, he says, Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. Ask it either in the depths or in the height above. But Ahaz said, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Then he said, Hear now, O house of David, is it a small thing for you to weary men, but will you weary my God also? Ahaz isn't doing what the Lord tells him to. See, he's not like Job. He doesn't do what the Lord tells him to. He's not even willing to receive this good news, which is absurd. And isn't that the case with a lot of people that we deal with? Just unwilling to hear the good news of Jesus Christ? You want to talk to them about Jesus, and they shut the door in your face, and they say, well, I don't want to talk about Jesus. Well, all I have is good news. The good news is that He's died for your sins, to take them away, to give you new life. They don't want to hear it. In verse 14 he says, therefore the Lord Himself will give you a sign. You won't listen to Him, then you'll get it anyway. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and you shall call his name Emmanuel. Curds and honey he shall eat, that he may know to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child shall know to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land that you dread will be forsaken by their kings. The Lord will bring the king of Assyria upon you and your people and your father's house, days that have not come since the day that Ephraim departed from Judah. And so it's good news and it's bad news. The good news is not only that this is not going to be an issue, they're not going to win, but more importantly, you're so freaking out, you're so upset, you're so distressed about this situation that you are missing the fact that I'm dealing with it. And in the time it takes for a virgin, that is an individual at that moment who is a virgin, a maiden, unmarried, to conceive, and in Isaiah's day, by natural causes, not a virgin birth and the Immaculate Conception that happens in Matthew 1, but more appropriately, simply a virgin who is currently a virgin, marries and is impregnated. She will bear a son, and by the time that child, that son, is able to tell the difference between good and evil, this situation will be resolved. The kings that you're fretting about, they're going to be no more. But the problem that you're having right now isn't going to be the problem you have later. Now he's talking about a physical situation. He's talking also about a physical child. And Matthew is going to take this, guided by the Holy Spirit, and understand that it's moving to a larger thing. Now here, he is talking not only about the physical situation of these two kings that are coming against him currently, but notice the end there. Not only are these two kings that you're worried about right now going to end, their life and their power are going to be destroyed. More importantly, I'm going to bring Assyria on your head. That means that while I've got good news, that about 10 years you're going to be fine. For about 10 years you're going to be fine, and your problems are going to be solved. More problems are coming because you are unfaithful. And the judgment is that the righteous are upheld physically, and the unjust and the unrighteous are punished. But not always in the way they expect. Now that's physically. And the concept here is a physical one. The first fulfillment symbolizes a physical salvation, of the people anyway. And yes, Assyria would come, and yes, Assyria would be an awful taskmaster to them and cause a lot of problems. This child that they're talking about is effectively a clock. It's a way for him to understand how long it's going to be without Isaiah just saying, about 12 years. So he gives this illustration. The second fulfillment that we find here in Matthew chapter 1 is a perfect spiritual salvation. That is to say, it applies in the most particular way and the most perfect way to our souls. But the point is the same. In the physical, that is to say, in Isaiah 7, its first fulfillment. The good news was that those problems would be resolved. But the bad news was that your unfaithfulness would be punished. And those principles remain the same here. The good news is that Christ is Lord of all, that He has died for your sins. The bad news is that you are in sin, and if that doesn't change, the unrighteous will find their place in the devil's fire, in hellfire, and punishment. And while God does not want that, God did not want Ahaz to reject him. God did not want Ahaz continuing in his unfaithfulness. God also does not want us in the New Testament to continue in our unfaithfulness. He would much prefer we become His. The faithful are vindicated, and the unrighteous are punished. And this is an expression that goes through the Bible altogether. This is something that the New Testament writers continually, Paul, throughout his letters, the Hebrews writer would point it out, that if angels and these incredible people from the Old Testament, if they were punished because of their iniquity, because of their unfaithfulness to God, how much more do we think we're going to be punished in relation to our unwillingness to hear the Son of God? If they rejected His words from prophets, how much more us from His Son? But we need to listen to Him. We need to hear Him. We need to recognize that Joseph had it right. That while he had to make hard decisions, and his life was not always as easy as he may have wanted it to be, that while he remained faithful to God, God was with him. God directed him. God helped him through these difficulties to make these decisions, as well as to deal with all the consequences of the decisions that would come by making good and righteous decisions. And yet, he remained faithful, and he became the adopted father. He became a part of something amazing. And the truth is that while we live in this world and it's ridiculous out there, that this world makes no sense. This world is awful and horrible, even to people of the world, for that matter. It's especially awful and horrible to people who claim to be Christians, who call on Christ. But there is a hope that goes beyond this life. That your hope is not in the acceptance of humans. It's not in how much people like you or feel that you are right. The hope is in being right in God's sight. And if we can help you with that this morning, we can help you join the most important group that you'll ever join. It's not a club, but it is a group of people. But it's admittance, the way you get into it, that it doesn't change. And just as those individuals on the day of Pentecost, when they had decided that they realized that they had sin in their lives, and they cry out to the apostles, "Men and brethren, what shall we do?" Then verse 37, and Peter responds to them, "Repent." That is to say, change your life in relation to God's will. Repent and let everyone be baptized in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of your sins. You have that opportunity today. If you're not a child of God, if you've not been washed and redeemed in His blood, you can follow His pathway. You can become something more. You can become part of something greater. And you can begin your walk with God, purified, perfected by His Son's blood.